During the discussions to reunify East and West Germany, the Western parties sought to defuse Moscow's fears that a reunified state in the heart of Europe would present a threat to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev only accepted German reunification, over which the Soviet Union had a legal right to veto, because he received assurances that NATO would not expand after he withdrew his forces from Eastern Europe. From James Baker, President George H. W. Bush, West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the CIA Director Robert Gates, French President François Mitterrand, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, British Foreign Minister Douglas Hurd, British Prime Minister John Major, and NATO Secretary-General Manfred Warner. A promise repeated by NATO's Secretary-General in a speech on May 17 that same year in Brussels. These promises were made orally and were never recorded in a treaty, and the Soviet Union still existed and the countries of Eastern Europe were still part of the Soviet structures, like the Warsaw Pact, which was not officially dissolved until July 1991. However, the promises not to expand NATO only lasted until 1997, when Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary were invited into the alliance despite Russia's complaints of betrayal. In total, 13 Eastern European states have become NATO members since then. NATO and senior Western officials have continued to claim that there was no such official promise. None of the assurances of non-expansion were included in any treaty documents, as NATO makes clear in its official explanation on its website. NATO allies take decisions by consensus and these are recorded. There is no record of any such decision having been taken by NATO. Personal assurances, from NATO leaders, cannot replace alliance consensus and do not constitute a formal NATO agreement. In 1962, in response to the presence of American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961, and Soviet fears of a Cuban drift towards China, Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev agreed to Cuba's request to place nuclear missiles on the island to deter a future invasion. An agreement was reached during a secret meeting between Khrushchev and Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro in July 1962, and construction of a number of missile launch facilities started later that summer. It was reported that Soviet was placing dangerous Soviet missiles 90 miles, 140 kilometers, from Florida. When this was reported to President John F. Kennedy, the U.S. announced it would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba and demanded that the weapons already in Cuba be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. He then convened a meeting of the 9 members of the National Security Council and 5 other key advisors, in a group that became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. During this meeting, President Kennedy was originally advised to carry out an airstrike on Cuban soil in order to compromise Soviet missile supplies, followed by an invasion of the Cuban mainland. After careful consideration, President Kennedy chose a less aggressive course of action, in order to avoid a declaration of war. After several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union, subject to United Nations verification, in exchange for a U.S. public declaration and agreement to not invade Cuba again. Secretly, the United States agreed with the Soviets that it would dismantle all of the Jupiter MRBMs which had been deployed to Turkey against the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, several former Eastern Bloc countries joined NATO, partly due to regional security threats such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia, 1992–1993, and the First Chechen War, 1994–1996. Russian leaders claimed Western powers pledged that NATO would not expand eastward. In November 2013, a wave of large-scale protests known as Euromaidan erupted in Ukraine, in response to President Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, instead choosing closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. In February of that year, the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly approved finalizing the agreement with the EU. Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject it. Several proposed truces failed to materialize, and on February 20, violence in Kiev escalated dramatically, with police and government security forces firing on crowds of protesters. The bloodiest week in Ukraine's post-Soviet history concluded on February 21 with an EU-brokered agreement between Yanukovych and opposition leaders that called for early elections and the formation of an interim unity government. Yanukovych, his power base crumbling, fled the capital ahead of an impeachment vote that stripped him of his powers as president. Pro-Russian protesters became increasingly assertive in Crimea. Groups of armed men whose uniforms lacked any clear identifying marks surrounded the airports in Simferopol and Sevastopol. Masked gunmen occupied the Crimean parliament building and raised a Russian flag, as pro-Russian lawmakers dismissed the sitting government and installed Sergei Aksyonov, the leader of the Russian Unity Party, as Crimea's prime minister. Voice and data links between Crimea and Ukraine were severed, and Russian authorities acknowledged that they had moved troops into the region. Russian President Vladimir Putin characterized it as an effort to protect Russian citizens and military assets in Crimea. Aksyonov declared that he, and not the government in Kiev, was in command of Ukrainian police and military forces in Crimea. On March 6 the Crimean parliament voted to secede from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation, with a public referendum on the matter scheduled for March 16, 2014. The move was hailed by Russia and broadly condemned in the West. Meanwhile, Yatsenyuk affirmed Kiev's position that Crimea was an integral part of Ukraine. On the day of the referendum, observers noted numerous irregularities in the voting process, including the presence of armed men at polling stations, and the result was an overwhelming 97% in favor of joining Russia. The interim government in Kiev rejected the result, and the United States and the EU imposed asset freezes and travel bans on numerous Russian officials and members of the Crimean parliament. On March 18 Putin met with Aksyonov and other regional representatives and signed a treaty incorporating Crimea into the Russian Federation. Within hours of the treaty's signing, a Ukrainian soldier was killed when masked gunmen stormed a Ukrainian military base outside Simferopol. Russian troops moved to occupy bases throughout the peninsula, including Ukrainian naval headquarters in Sevastopol, as Ukraine initiated the evacuation of some 25,000 military personnel and their families from Crimea. On March 21, after the ratification of the annexation treaty by the Russian parliament, Putin signed a law formally integrating Crimea into Russia. Heavily armed pro-Russian gunmen stormed government buildings in the eastern Ukrainian cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, Horlivka, and Kramatorsk. In Kharkiv a group of ostensibly local gunmen mistakenly seized an opera house, believing it to be City Hall. As was the case in Crimea, a number of these takeovers were executed by men with Russian equipment, in uniforms bearing no insignia, acting with military precision. In the city of Slavyansk in the Donetsk basin, a gun battle erupted as pro-Russian militiamen occupied buildings and established roadblocks, and Russian-backed paramilitaries seized part of the Donbass region of southeastern Ukraine, which consists of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, sparking a regional war. In December 2021, Russia advanced 2 draft treaties that contained requests for what it referred to as security guarantees, including a legally binding promise that Ukraine would not join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and a reduction in NATO troops and material stationed in Eastern Europe, and threatened unspecified military response if those demands were not met in full. NATO rejected these requests, and the United States warned Russia of swift and severe economic sanctions. In March 2021, Russia began a large military buildup along its border with Ukraine, amassing up to 190,000 troops and their equipment. He sees Ukraine's intention of joining NATO as a threat to Russia and an expansion of NATO to the east. He also accused NATO of betrayal by not honoring the promises they made in 1990. He said an objective of the invasion was the demilitarization of Ukraine, that would make it unable to join NATO. The invasion began on the morning of February 24, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Russian attacks were initially launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kiev, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia's advance towards Kiev stalled in March, with Russian troops retreating from the northern front by April. On the southern and southeastern fronts, Russia captured Kherson in March and then Mariupol in May after a siege.